Hey everybody, I hope you're doing good. This is chapter 1 of part 1 of Michael Heinrich's The Science of Value. Part 1 of the book is titled Anthropology as Affirmation, the Theoretical Field of Political Economy. And just to read the table of contents for chapter 1, which is titled Classical Political Economy. 1. Labor and property in early bourgeois social philosophy. 2. Subjective labor theory of value and production cost theory in Adam Smith. 3. Smith is a theorist of surplus value, on the critique of Marx's reception of classical economics, part 1. 4. Value and average profit in David Ricardo. 5. Ricardo is an inconsistent labor theorist of value, on the critique of Marx's reception of classical economics, part 2. 6. Value theory as a critique of capitalism, the quote Ricardian socialists. No. Okay. So let's party. I might break this up into sections, so let's see. It seems like it kind of makes sense. This is kind of a long chapter. The specific object of political economy emerges only with and within bourgeois society. While economic questions were indeed discussed in the Greek polis and during the Middle Ages, the subject matter of political economy is not simply a sum of economic problems arising in various contexts, rather it is the economy. The production and distribution of wealth is an autonomous sphere of society governed by its own laws. It is precisely this autonomy and governance by its own laws that allows us to speak of an independent science. Such a conception of the economy becomes possible only with the emergence of capitalist commodity production. As this mode of production dissolves all organic ties between social status and productive activity, as well as all traditional forms of social organization, politics and the economy emerge as distinct spheres. State and society now confront one another. State life is political, while social life is primarily economic. Political economy is an empirical science of an autonomous economic sphere, is therefore possible only within bourgeois society. Only a retrospective historiography, one that uses the contemporary conceptual apparatus as a yardstick for the ideas of the past, can group the economic topics addressed by the Greeks and in the Middle Ages as, quote, forerunners of modern science. In doing so, it overlooks the fact that the organization of knowledge in these societies took a fundamentally different form, and that their, quote, economic inquiries possess no independent significance outside their specific theoretical context. Even under mercantilism, observations were compiled solely for instrumental purposes to serve the sovereign. Political economy as a science with an independent subject matter, as a, quote, pure science underlying various applications, began to emerge within mercantilism and physiocracy and received its first formulation in classical English economics. Such a political economy has no precursors outside of bourgeois society. However, political economy is not merely one of many new sciences emerging alongside bourgeois society. Political economy is a central locus of societal self-reflection, though through political economy, bourgeois society gains a conception of itself. With the establishment of capitalist commodity production and free competition, individuals are increasingly detached from their traditional social ties and personal dependencies, confronting one another in the marketplace as isolated commodity owners. Pursuing their own economic advantage, the individual, reduced to the status of a commodity owner, now appears as the quintessential human being. As spontaneous social structures are gradually dissolved and replaced by the impersonal force of the market, society ceases to be a community that pre-exists and unites individuals, Instead, it appears to be constituted by these very individuals, who have been severed from all social bonds. Consequently, the possibility of social integration for these, quote, isolated individuals, in quote, parenthesis, Marx, in parenthesis, who pursue only their economic ends, becomes a problem for any mode of thought that reflects upon social cohesion. Since the economy lies at the heart of the bourgeois social life, the socio-philosophical question of what bourgeois society actually is can, in the final analysis, be answered only by political economy. To early bourgeois social theorists, the individual, abstracted from all social ties, appears as the primordial state of nature for humanity. In this unsocial, natural human being, they find the supposedly unshakable foundation for their theorizing. Unshakable foundation. However, if sociality is not presupposed, but rather emerges only subsequently through the market, a problem arises. How can individuals act freely and solely in accordance with their own interests, while simultaneously realizing a shared morality and utility? Mandeville solves this problem, as it were, at a stroke by equating individual egoism with social utility. Private vices yield public benefits. By contrast, in the tradition of sentimentalist ethics, tracing back to Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, and Hume, the moral sentiments of approval and disapproval regarding actions, sentiments presumed to be already present within the individual's utilitarian conduct, serve as the mediating link between individual interest and shared morality. Yet if these subjective evaluations are to constitute an objective standard, such moral sentiments must be present in all human beings, however culturally shaped to the same degree. They thus become part of humanity's transhistorical endowment, part of its instinctual nature. The sociality of bourgeois individuals is thereby traced back to nature, to the instinctual nature of the human being. If, however, it is nature that brings about socialization, it follows logically to seek the natural laws governing the economic activity through which this socialization unfolds. While this approach begins to grasp the dynamics of reified social relations, it simultaneously reproduces within thought the illusory thing-like appearance of these relations as something natural. Atomized commodity owners appear just as a subject to economic Atomized commodity owners appear just as subject to economic laws as physical atoms are to the laws of mechanics. However, the utilitarian ethics of the commodity owner and the political economy built upon them do not serve solely to affirm the identity of the emerging bourgeois society. They are at the same time the ideological weapons of a bourgeoisie emancipating itself from the feudal nobility and the clergy. If the economy is subject to scientifically discernible laws, then one must submit to these laws just as one does to the laws of nature. Absolutist interventions in the freedom of citizens' economic activity can now be rejected by invoking, quote, scientific reason. The same scientific reason will later be used to counter the demands of the working class. Through political economy, bourgeois society affirms itself as the best of all possible worlds, claiming that it alone is suited to, quote, human nature. The discussion of what Marx termed classical political economy and of neoclassical economics in this and the following chapter is not intended to provide a concise history of economic theories. Rather, the aim is to reveal the theoretical terrain shared by both the classical and neoclassical schools by examining central aspects of their respective theories of value and capital. This provides not only a backdrop against which the break between Marxian theory and this field can be discussed, but also through an examination of Marx's interpretation of the history of economic theory, specifically his reception of Smith and Ricardo, and his distinction between scientific economics and vulgar economics, a means to identify shortcomings in his own theoretical self-conception that point to ambivalences within Marx's discourse. 1. So here's the... I'll see how long this is recording, but this is the first section of the book. Of the chapter. 1. Labor and property in early bourgeois social philosophy. The rapidly growing importance of manufacture-based production in the 17th century brought the developmental potential of the productive forces of labor into the public consciousness. This also shifted the focus of economic thought from the sphere of circulation to the sphere of production. This marked the birth of classical political economy, which is ultimately to completely displace the mercantilism that had previously prevailed. While mercantilism had explained prices in terms of the relationship between supply and demand, theoretical interest now shifted to the center of fluctuation of market prices, a point that appeared to depend on the intrinsic or real value of commodities. By seeking the determinants of this real value in production, the labor theory of value began to take shape in the history of economic thought. The very way the question is framed distinguishes the discourse of classical political economy from the economic discourse of the Middle Ages. In the latter, the moral philosophical question regarding the, quote, just price of a good took center stage. Now the inquiry, akin to the natural sciences, seeks the center of gravity of price movements. Yet political economy was never merely a descriptive science. Precisely by tracing the value of a commodity back to the producer's labor, it could be deployed normatively against the feudal nobility, who appeared as an unproductive and parasitic class. In doing so, however, early bourgeois social philosophy faced a fundamental dilemma. On the one hand, it asserted that property grounded in one's own labor was a natural right, thereby challenging the legitimacy of social arrangements that endowed the landowning nobility, who lived solely off ground rent, with traditional privileges. On the other hand, it could not overlook the propertylessness of the working poor. It was therefore compelled to justify their lack of property despite their labor. This dilemma found its classical resolution in the property theory of John Locke, who thereby became the philosophical mouthpiece of the rising property bourgeoisie. Like most early bourgeois social theorists, Locke posits a pre-political, quote, state of nature, from which the state emerges only through a social contract. In this state of nature, human beings are said to have been entirely free, bound only by the law of nature. Locke identifies the preservation of creation, and thus the preservation of humanity, as the supreme imperative. In his theory of property, Locke attempts to establish the basis for private property within the state of nature. He begins with the problem of how ownership of individual objects is possible at all, given that God gave the earth to humanity in common. To sustain their lives, Locke argues individuals must appropriate specific objects. There must therefore be a mechanism for individual appropriation. Locke identifies this possibility in the, quote, mixing with labor. Labor is the indisputable property of the laborer. When he mixes it with an object, he makes that object his own property. However, this individual property extends not only to the fruits of the earth necessary for survival, but also to the land itself, which is cultivated through labor. Through the addition of labor, what God gave to humanity in common becomes individual property. Yet, Locke does not thereby establish merely a society of small-scale self-employed owners, for as his examples demonstrate, he includes the labor of a servant with one's own labor from the outset, implying that wage labor must exist even in the state of nature. The fact that labor is a person's property means that for Locke, ownership is not limited to the product of one's own labor. Rather, it makes it possible to sell one's labor itself, and not merely its product. Locke's natural law justification for private property rests on the necessity of self-preservation. He conceives of common property only in the form of uncultivated land. For him, productive use and private appropriation are inextricably linked. From the original purpose of appropriation, the preservation of life, Locke derives two natural law limits on the acquisition of property. One must not accumulate so much that it spoils, and other people must have the same opportunities for appropriation to sustain their own lives. However, Locke does not stop at this justification for private property, which would allow the individual only modest holdings. With the invention of money, it became possible to acquire larger estates. Through exchange for money, gold and silver, perishable goods can be transferred into imperishable ones. This removes the first limit on acquisition. The possibility of making one's possessions permanent through hoarding becomes a driving force to increase them, ultimately leading to the effective breaching of the second limit on acquisition. Locke justifies the legitimacy of this as follows. Since relatively useless items like gold and silver, quote, derive their value solely from the agreement of men, end quote, it is, quote, evident that men have consented to unequal and disproportionate land ownership, end quote. In short, whoever consents to the use of money cannot complain about the consequences. Locke views money not as a departure from the state of nature, but as an integral part of the state of nature. Without an explicit contract, people tacitly agree to assign value to money. Consequently, the removal of natural law limits on acquisition, brought about by the use of money, occurs while still within the state of nature. For Locke, therefore, inequality of possession is not a political invention that contradicts his natural law foundation, as Marx argues in Theories of Surplus Value, but is itself sanctioned by natural law. However, the drive to increase possessions, which arise from the existence of money, pushes beyond the state of nature. It creates unstable conditions and necessitates the state as a guarantor of security. Locke thus regards the preservation of money as the state's most important function. His state is a state of property owners. With his theory of property, Locke not only elevated private property based on labor to the status of a natural right, but also legitimized the propertylessness of the poorer classes, despite their own labor, since they had tacitly consented to the use of money, the very source of unequal possession. Yet Locke does not limit himself to this rather formal argument. He employs a simple labor theory of value to justify the prosperity generated by private appropriation, since the greater part of value is created by labor. The appropriation and cultivation of land increase rather than diminished humanity's wealth, as cultivated land yields more produce than uncultivated land. As a result of this state of affairs, Locke claims a day laborer in England is better off than an Indian king. Locke not only justifies the private accumulation of wealth on the basis of natural law, but also articulated the fundamental tenet of liberal economic theory, that the development of private property leads to general prosperity. This credo is formulated most provocatively by Bernard Mandeville in his famous Fable of the Bees. It is precisely the vices of individuals that increase the wealth and power of the commonwealth. Mandeville's aim here is not to defend vice, but rather to highlight its objective function within capitalist society, a mechanism he seeks to describe with blunt candor. Thus, Mandeville explicitly states that it is the labor of the poor that creates wealth, and that the poor therefore constitute a country's true wealth. For Mandeville, however, this situation does not give rise to a problem of legitimation as it did for Locke, but rather one of proper management. A poor working mass is essential for societal wealth. Higher wages would undermine general prosperity, and better education would merely make the poor dissatisfied with their lot. Consequently, he vehemently opposed charity schools and state measures aimed at improving the condition of the proletariat. Rarely thereafter was the propertied class's vested interest in the poverty of the poor expressed with such candor. Okay, I'm not going to break this video up into sections. We're only 18 minutes in here, so I'm just going to read the whole chapter then. Section 2, Subjective Labor Theory of Value and Production Cost in Adam Smith. Smith's Wealth of Nations marked the first high point of classical political economy, even though meticulous philological research would confirm Schumpeter's verdict that Smith's Wealth of Nations contained, quote, no really new ideas, end quote. Smith was nonetheless the first to treat political economy with a comprehensive systematic framework. Indeed, he was the one who truly established it as an independent science. For an examination of the theoretical terrain of bourgeois economics, however, Smith is of interest not only as its first system builder, but also because, in his work, the link between political economy and bourgeois moral philosophy, a connection that later became largely implicit, remains explicitly present. Locke's book, Smith's book, published the Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, stands within the English-Scottish tradition of empiricist ethics based on sentiment. However, the claim that this work provides the moral philosophical foundation for his economic theories is not undisputed. While in The Wealth of Nations he identifies self-interest as the decisive driving force of human behavior, in The Theory of Moral Sentiments he observes that alongside self-interest, people also take an interest in the happenings of their fellow human beings. He made, quote, sympathy, by which Smith meant the capacity to put oneself in another's situation and share their feelings, the basis of moral judgment. If one's own imagined feelings and the resulting actions align with the actual feelings of others, they are accepted as proper. However, the judgments reached in this way possess objective moral validity only if they are made by a, quote, impartial spectator, end quote. Whether Smith's moral theory contradicts or complements his economic theory has been passionately debated for over a century as the, quote, Adam Smith problem. Upon closer inspection, the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, proves to be far less altruistic than it might initially appear. The principle of sympathy upon which moral judgments are based has nothing to do with mutual self-sacrifice. Rather, it focuses on empathizing with the motives of others. In this respect, the utility of actions is one of the central reasons leading to their approval by the, quote, impartial spectator, end quote. Adam Smith. In contrast to Hume, however, Smith emphasizes that it is not so much the utility of the things being pursued that merits approval, but rather the development of the faculties and means employed in the process. Indeed, the actual comforts achieved often fail to compensate for the effort expended, a fact that usually goes unnoticed. Fuck, I lost my spot. Fuck. Indeed, the actual comforts achieved often fail to compensate for the effort expended, a fact that usually goes unnoticed or is realized too late. Yet this deception of nature, end quote, proves to be extraordinarily beneficial, insofar as it fosters the unfolding of human economic potential. Ultimately, it is the unintended consequences of our actions that, for Smith, constitute the foundation of general welfare. Quote, the rich consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, though they mean only their own conveniency, though the sole end to which they propose from the labors of all the thousands whom they employ to be the gratification of their own vain and insatiable desires, they divide the poor the produce of all their improvements. End quote. Smith. However, these unintended consequences of action do not merely promote general welfare. The, quote, rich are, by, quote, an invisible hand, parenthesis, mentioned here for the first time, in parenthesis, even prompted to bring about a distribution that is approximately just. Smith continues as the cited passage, quote, continues at the cited passage, quote, they are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. When Providence divided the earth among a few lordly masters, it neither forgot nor abandoned those who seemed to have been left out in the partition. These last two enjoy their share of all that it produces. Okay. Smith. Already in his moral theory is the teleology of bourgeois production, parenthesis, metaphorically termed the, quote, invisible hand, end quote, in parenthesis, that mediates between the self-interest-driven concerns of atomized producers and the general interests of society. While Smith merely states this outcome here, the mechanism of this mediation forms the subject of his economic work. In the book, An Inquiry to the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, Smith undertakes not only the investigation of, quote, wealth announced in the title, but also an axiomatic examination of public finances and Europe's economic development since Roman times. He offers a critique of various economic policy concepts and covers much else one would not necessarily expect in an economic study, such as a description of the procedures for electing bishops in the early church. Smith divides wealth as the quantity of available consumer goods and luxury goods. It depends on the number of people contributing to its production, but above all on the productive powers of labor. The subject of his inquiry in the first book, which contains the theoretical core of his work, is the causes of this improvement in the productive powers of labor, and the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks and conditions of men in the society. Smith. Smith's very framing of the question, viewing production not in terms of social relations but solely as productive forces, and seeking a, quote, natural order, unquote, in distribution, reflects a conception of the economy as a natural phenomenon. Smith made the premise that labor in general, rather than just a specific type of labor, is the source of all wealth, the deliberate starting point for his analysis of the entire system of bourgeois economics. Early proponents of the labor theory of value did not yet strictly distinguish between the use value and exchange value of commodities. Thus, while Petty already identified labor as a measure of value, he simultaneously stated that, quote, labor is the father and active principle of wealth, as lands are the mother, end quote. William Petty. Smith, however, clearly distinguishes between the, quote, value in use and the, quote, value in exchange of commodities, explaining, quote, the things which have the greatest value in use have frequently little or no value in exchange, and on the contrary, those which have the greatest value in exchange have frequently little or no value in use, end quote. Smith, The Wealth of Nations. Where the hell am I? By ruling out from the start any theory of value based on, quote, utility, Smith breaks with the long-standing theoretical tradition extending from Pufendorf to his teacher Hutcheson. From a neoclassical perspective, this means Smith led political economy in England down a regrettable path. Parenthesis, see, for example, Douglas, 1928, Robertson and Taylor, 1957. Conversely, Marx regards Smith, parenthesis, and Ricardo, parenthesis, as the finest minds in bourgeois economics precisely because of their approaches based on the labor theory of value. It remains to be examined in what sense one can speak of a labor theory of value in the work of Smith and Ricardo, and whether the Marxist interpretation does justice to it. Smith intends to examine the, quote, principles which regulate the exchangeable value of commodities, end quote, in 3 steps. First, by presenting the, quote, real measure of, end quote, of value, or the, quote, real price, end quote, of commodities. Second, by outlining the various components of this price. And finally, by discussing the circumstances that cause these price components to sometimes rise above or fall below their, quote, natural rates, end quote. Smith. Smith identifies labor as the measure of a commodity's exchange value. However, it is not the quantity of labor expended in the production of the commodity that constitutes the measure, but rather the quantity of other people's labor obtained in exchange. To justify this measure, Smith points out that, following the introduction of the division of labor, an individual can procure only a small fraction of the necessities of life through their own labor and is therefore dependent on the labor of others. Smith thus implies that wealth depends on one's own labor only insofar as that labor can be equated with the labor of others, that is, insofar as one's own labor counts as social labor. Yet Smith does not further examine the specific social character of commodity-producing labor. Smith does not conceive of exchange as the form of mediation that constitutes the overall social nexus, but merely as an isolated act between 2 separate commodity producers. It is therefore entirely consistent for him to appeal to the individual calculations of commodity owners to further justify his measure. Quote, the real price of everything, What everything really costs to the man who wants to acquire it is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. What is bought with money or with goods is purchased by labor, as much as what we acquire by the toil of our own body. That money or these goods indeed save us this toil." Unquote. Here Smith conceives of labor in a strictly non-social manner as a relationship between an isolated producer and nature. For the individual, this engagement with nature signifies first and foremost toil and exertion. Exchange spares one the effort of acquiring an object through one's own labor by making this saved labor the measure of exchange value. Smith grounds this measure in the rational behavior oriented towards self-interest of individual equal commodity owners. In A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx characterizes precisely this approach when he writes that Smith, quote, mistakes the objective equation which the social process forcibly establishes between unequal labors for the subjective equality of individual labors, end quote. Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Within this non-social conception of exchange, there is no proper place for money either. Smith views it merely as a mechanism that facilitates exchange. He distinguishes the price expressed in money, termed the mere, quote, nominal price, from labor as the real measure of value, or the, quote, real price. For Smith, no intrinsic connection exists between commodity and money. The monetary sphere appears as a mere veil over the real sphere, a veil that, at least in theory, can be removed at any time. In this respect, Smith does not actually address commodity exchange, but merely barter, the exchange of products. For Smith, the specific social character that commodity owners establish through exchange is ultimately grounded in their individually laborious relationship with nature. Smith thus conceives of social interconnectedness as being directly constituted by the unsocial behavior of isolated individuals. The phenomenon of political economy are then rooted in the empirically observable anthropology of the commodity owner, a figure hypostasized as the embodiment of, quote, man itself. Smith also explicitly reflects upon this anthropology. Regarding the origin of the division of labor, he states, quote, "It is the necessary, though very slow and gradual, consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, ... the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another, ... It is common to all men, and to be found in no other race of animals," end quote. Smith. Thus Smith not only equates any social division of labor with commodity production, he views the latter as a consequence of human nature. He does not stop here. He offers a functional explanation for this propensity to exchange, quote, propensity exchange among almost all animal species. The adult individual is independent and requires no assistance. Humans, however, depend on the help of their fellow beings that can hardly count on their benevolence. They can therefore only achieve their aims, quote, if he can interest their self-love in his favor, and show them that it is for their own advantage to do for him what he requires of them, end quote. Smith. Ultimately, the, quote, propensity to exchange, end quote, is grounded in the mutual indifference of human beings. The estrangement of commodity owners, isolated from one another, thus bears the ontological bedrock from which the entire economy unfolds. Essential elements of the underlying theoretical framework become apparent in Smith's discussion of the division of labor as a measure of value and money. Both anthropologism, which proceeds from a specific, quote, essence of the human being that for Smith coincides with that of the commodity owner, and individualism, which reconstructs the social nexus starting from isolated individuals who are strangers to one another, enter into Smith's argumentation as self-evident premises. Having determined the measure of value or its, quote, real price, Smith proceeds as announced to examine the components of this real price. Smith distinguishes between the, quote, real measure of value, end quote, and the, quote, regulator of value. The fact that the value of a commodity is measured by the amount of other people's labor it commands tells us nothing, however, about how much of that labor a commodity actually commands. The rule determining the magnitude of a commodity's value still needs to be stated. Here Smith identifies a distinction between pre-capitalist and capitalist conditions. For pre-capitalist times, the following applies, quote, in that early and rude state of society which precedes both the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land, the proportion between the quantities of labor necessary for acquiring different objects seems to be the only circumstance which can afford any rule for exchanging them for one another. In this state of things, the whole product of labor belongs to the laborer, and the quantity of labor commonly employed in acquiring or producing any commodity is the only circumstance which can regulate the quantity of labor which it ought commonly to purchase, command, or exchange for, end quote. Smith. Smith does not derive the rule determining the quantity of labor that can be purchased with a commodity from empirical observation. Rather, it is an empirical speculative model arrived at through a thought experiment. Two commodity producers acting solely in their own self-interest are placed opposite one another in a hypothetical scenario, market exchange, yet production without capital. Their behavior is deduced from these basic assumptions. Since producing one's own commodity entails effort, a producer will exchange it for commodities whose production would require less effort. Thus, the labor of others that I receive in exchange for my commodity serves as the measure of its value, while the labor I myself must expend to produce my commodity constitutes the rule determining how much of others' labor I receive, namely exactly the same amount, insofar as labor serves here as a measure of value and the regulator of the magnitude of value, one can speak of a labor theory of value. However, contrary to the distinction which became common between the advent of marginalism between a, quote, objective labor theory of value and a, quote, subjective utility theory of value, what we find in Smith is actually a subjective labor theory of value. Both the measure and the regulation of value are grounded in the subjective interest of the commodity owner, an interest oriented toward utility. And I think I've heard this kind of theory of value referred to as like a labor pain theory of value. And this is also precisely how Engels, when he talks about like simple commodity production, which is highly criticized, but the idea of like once upon a time, people in like local communities knew how much of commodity producers knew how much people who were engaged in different aspects of the social division of labor engaged in how much labor they contributed to the creation of their products, and thus the amount of that was paid for each individual commodity, the amount exchanged for each individual commodity, was determined by the knowledge of the parties to exchange about the labor processes of others, right? So people are like, it only took you so long to make that pair of shoes, right? It only took you so long to do that, so I'm only going to give you so much for this, and that kind of thing, right? Is the idea is like the idea of like a labor theory of value being like some kind of subjective estimation about what a just price is. Seems like what's been saying here by Smith. So let me repeat that last sentence I read. However, contrary to the distinction which became common with the advent of marginalism between a, quote, objective labor theory of value and a, quote, subjective utility theory of value. What we find in Smith is actually a subjective labor theory of value. Both the measure and the regulator of value are grounded in the subjective interest of the commodity owner, an interest oriented toward utility. With the formation of capital, however, the conditions under which exchange takes place change, giving rise to a different constellation of interests. While this does not alter the measure of value, namely the labor of others, since that measure rests solely on the fact that labor requires effort and the labor of others therefore saves effort, the rule just derived from determining the magnitude of value does change. Quote, as soon as stock has accumulated in the hands of particular persons, some of them will naturally employ it in setting to work industrious people, whom they will supply with materials and subsistence, in order to make a profit by the sale of their work, or by what their labor adds to the value of the materials. The value which the workman adds to the materials, therefore, resolves itself in this case into two parts, of which one pays their wages, the other the profits of their employer, upon the whole stock of materials and wages which he advances. He could have no interest to employ them, unless he expected from the sale of their work something more than what was sufficient to replace his stock to them, and he could have no interest to employ a great stock rather than a small one, quote, unless his profits were to bear some proportion to the extent of his stock, unquote. Smith does not concern himself with the possibility of the, quote, accumulation of stock, unquote, or the origins of the, quote, industrious people, unquote. Smith presupposes just both as conditions of capitalist production. Smith presupposes both the accumulation of stock and the origin and the industrious people as conditions of capitalist production. Yet once these conditions are present, profit must also exist as an incentive for investment, specifically a profit proportionate to the size of the capital, serving as an incentive for ever greater investment. Smith immediately conceives of profit as average profit, thereby explicitly establishing it as an independent category of income distinct from wages, something that was by no means a matter of course in the 18th century. He explains the form of profit as average profit simply by citing the capital owner's, quote, natural interest, end quote, just as he had previously traced the old rule back to the interest of commodity owners. Smith simply accepts the very existence of an average profit as an empirical fact. Here empiricism becomes evident as another element of the theoretical framework with which Smith argues. Economic facts such as the existence of an average profit appear as simple givens that can be read directly from the real object, without the need for any conceptual mediation. While the existence of profit does not alter the measure of value, commanded labor, it does change the rule determining the quantity of labor of commodity commands. Quote, in this state of things, the whole produce of labor does not always belong to the laborer. He must, in most cases, share it with the owner of the stock which employs him. Neither is the quantity of labor commonly employed in acquiring or producing any commodity the only circumstance which can regulate the quantity which it ought commonly to purchase, command, or exchange for. An additional quantity, it is evident, must be due for the profits of stock which advances the wages and furnishes the materials of that labor, end quote. Smith. Since ground rent also usually has to be paid, Smith continues, it too constitutes a factor determining how much labor a commodity can command. Smith also recursively breaks down expenditures on raw materials into wages, profits, and rents, arriving at the following conclusion. Quote, wages, profit, and rent are the three original sources of all revenue as well as of all exchangeable value. End quote. If the price of a commodity is just sufficient to cover the, quote, natural rates of wages, profits, and rents, Smith's term for the rates customary in a given country at a given time, in parentheses, then the commodity is sold at its, quote, natural price, end quote. Quote, the commodity is then sold precisely for what the commodity is worth, or for what it really costs the person who brings it to market, end quote. Smith. Regarding the regulator of value magnitude, Smith here becomes the founder of a production cost theory of value, one that would be adopted by Jean-Baptiste Say and John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, and eventually reappear in the work of Alfred Marshall. Here the theory of value becomes identical to the theory of distribution. The magnitude of a commodity's value is now constituted by the quote, natural returns to the factors employed in its production, labor, capital, and land. Smith has now arrived, as announced in the introduction to The Wealth of Nations, at the quote, natural distribution of the product among the various classes. However, he fails to truly determine the quote, natural rates of these returns. For wages, he identifies the worker's subsistence as the lower limit, though in doing so he becomes entangled in a circular argument. Commodity prices depend on the natural wage rate, yet that rate is in turn determined by commodity prices. The profit rate is posited as equal to the interest rate plus a risk premium. Regarding interest, however, Smith can only state that it is regulated by the ratio of the supply of loans to the demand for them. Finally, Smith defines ground rent as a monopoly price for the use of land. Yet in this view, it is not the cause but the consequence of the level of commodity prices, and thus not a quote, source of value. Smith distinguishes the actual market price from the quote, natural price. In a system of quote, perfect liberty, end quote, competition will reduce profits, wages, and rents to their quote, natural level. Their quote, natural rates, causing market prices to gravitate toward natural prices. Natural prices represent a state of long-term equilibrium, and the operation of competition guarantees that this equilibrium is attained. However, the equilibrium in Smith's analysis is not static but dynamic, emerging only in the course of capital accumulation. Neither this equilibrium nor the general prosperity resulting from economic growth is consciously pursued by the individual, and yet they are the outcome of his actions. Quote, he generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which has no part of his intention. While mercantilism saw the unity of the economy as guaranteed by the actions of the sovereign and only by them, Smith here formulates the opposite view. From the quote, natural inclination of individuals to pursue their own interests, chaos does not follow, but rather a quote, natural order, end quote. This order is natural insofar as it corresponds to human nature, and therefore also superior to any artificial order, whether oriented toward the will of the sovereign or toward any ideals. Thus it is shown, civil society is the best of all possible worlds. Section 3. Smith is a theorist of surplus value. On the critique of Marx's reception of classical economics, Part 1. Marx engaged extensively with Smith in theories of surplus value. There Marx reproaches Smith for, quote, confusing or indeed displacing the determination of the value of commodities by the quantity of labor required for their production, with the quantity of living labor which a commodity can be purchased. Let me repeat that. Quote, confusing or indeed displacing the determination of the value of commodities by the quantity of labor required for their production, with the quantity of living labor which a commodity can be purchased. Unquote. Marx explains Smith's simultaneous use of two different value determinations by noting that Smith starts from the commodity and that in pre-capitalist commodity production, the entire product belongs to the producer. The alien labor I can command with my commodity is, in that case, always the labor objectified in the other commodity. The two value determinations therefore coincide. However, Marx continues, when examining capitalist relations, Smith would observe that the wage laborer's living labor no longer exchanges for the same quantity of objectified labor, or commodity, and would therefore conclude, quote, that labor time is no longer the immanent measure regulating the exchange value of commodities, unquote. Marx argues, abandoned his initially correct determination of value based on labor time, and now identifies value with the notion of, quote, natural price, a concept stemming from the appearance of competition. However, Marx does not entirely do justice to Smith in his critique, as he conflates Smith's discussion between the measure of value, distinction. Let me repeat that. However, Marx does not entirely do justice to Smith in his critique, as he conflates Smith's distinction between the measure of value and the rule determining the magnitude of value. Marx interprets Smith's measure of value and the rule governing the pre-capitalist state as a more or less correct labor theory of value, where value is determined by the labor time expended in production, which Smith then simply discards when examining capitalist conditions. Yet, as shown in the preceding section, Smith consistently adheres to the measure of value, commanded alien labor, contrary to Marx's insinuation. The labor time expended in the production of the commodity is not a second measure, but rather the rule that determines in the pre-capitalist state how much labor a commodity commands. Marx does not dispute the fact that this rule does not apply to the empirically observable exchange ratios under capitalist conditions. The problem with Smith is not that he is inconsistent as Marx accuses him of being, but rather that he contents himself with merely noting these two rules empirically. In other words, Smith's argumentation is consistent within his theoretical framework, although that framework itself is open to criticism. Marx does, however, concede that Smith's confusion regarding value theory has no impact on, quote, the development of surplus value in general, end quote. Marx bases his assessment that Smith, quote, recognized the true origin of surplus value, end quote, primarily on the statement by Smith cited above, quote, the value which the workmen add to the materials therefore resolves itself in this case into two parts, of which one pays their wages, the other the profits, end quote. Smith, which he comments on as follows, quote, here then, this is Marx, which Marx comments on as follows, quote, here then, Smith expressly declares, the profit made upon the sale of the product does not stem from the sale itself. Rather, the value, i.e. the quantity of labor the workers impart to the material, splits into two parts. One pays their wages, the other part constitutes the capitalist profit, end quote. Marx. And since Smith also traced rent back to a portion of the product of the workers' labor, Marx concludes, quote, Adam Smith thus conceives of surplus value, namely surplus labor, as the general category of which actual profit and ground rent are merely offshoots. Nevertheless, he does not distinguish surplus value as such, as a category separate from the specific forms surplus value assumes in profit and ground rent. However, Smith himself not only failed to formulate an explicit theory of surplus value regarding capitalist conditions, he did not even define exchange value by the labor time necessary for production, but rather as the sum of the independent magnitudes of wages, profit, and rent. Marx is therefore compelled to conclude that, quote, after Adam Smith has developed the nature of surplus value and value, he wrongly presents capital and land as independent sources of exchange value, end quote. Marx. As an explanation for this curious shift in the mode of explanation, which occurs within the span of just a few pages in Smith's work, Marx can only suggest that Smith was misled by the appearance of competition and, quote, forgets his deeper view, end quote. It is questionable, however, whether Smith actually held the, quote, deeper conception of surplus value attributed to Smith by Marx. In the quotation cited above, Marx renders Smith's statement, quote, the value which the workman adds to the materials, therefore, resolves, end quote, with a crucial interpolation, quote, the value, i.e. the quantity of labor that the workers impart to the material, resolves, end quote. Parenthesis, emphasis added in parenthesis. Marx interprets Smith's qualitative statement, the workers add value to the raw material, as a quantitative determination of the value added. Namely, that it depends solely on the quantity of labor added. Marx makes the same shift from quantitative to qualitative statements elsewhere as well, in the passage upon which he bases his interpretation. Smith, however, is primarily concerned with resolving the quantitative question. He seeks to determine how much value is added by the worker's labor, ultimately concluding that the quantity of added value cannot depend solely on the quantity of labor expended. Since Smith proceeds from the assumption of an average rate of profit from the outset, it is clear to Smith that the sum of wages and profit, into which the value added during a workday is supposed to resolve, depends on the magnitude of the capital employed. Smith does not ask how this is possible. Rather, he simply states that this is the case under capitalist conditions. Marx's judgment that Smith conceived a surplus value, quote, as the general category, unquote, but merely failed to distinguish it, quote, as a distinct category from the specific forms it assumes in profit and ground rent, unquote, constitutes a, quote, symptomatic reading, unquote, insofar as Marx relates Smith's text to a different discourse, whereas Marx typically uses such a symptomatic reading to reveal the absence of that discourse. Here, Marx takes the view that this discourse is present, quote, in substance, unquote. He attributes to Smith the definition of commodity value based on the labor time necessary for production, a premise Smith does not in fact adopt for capitalist conditions, and thus concludes that the entrepreneur's profit must be the value expression of a portion of the labor time contributed by the worker. However, this profit cannot be identical to the average profit, a new non-empirical category. Surplus value must be introduced to account for it. Instead of noting the absence of this category in Smith's work, Marx merely notes the absence of the word itself, which he traces back to the absence of a distinction. Smith failed to separate surplus value from surplus value's forms of appearance, profit, rent, etc. Yet the essential aspect of the category of surplus value is precisely its distinction from its forms of appearance. Surplus value is a category that possesses no immediate empirical correlate. It belongs neither to the quasi-empirical level of an empirical speculative model, such as the, quote, early and rude state of society, unquote, for which Smith postulates exchange based on the labor time required for production, nor to the level of immediate observation. Yet Smith operates on no other levels. The failure to distinguish surplus value from its forms of appearance is therefore not merely a shortcoming. It represents the absence of the category itself. Smith cannot possibly possess the category of surplus value, not even, quote, in substance, unquote, because he lacks the theoretical level upon which this category is situated. The inadequacy of Marx's interpretation of Smith went unnoticed, even in the subsequent discussion. Engels, for instance, fully aligns himself with Marx's own assessment, when in the preface to the second volume of Capital, which Engels edited, Engels compares Marx's relationship to classical economics with that of Lavoisier to Priestley and Scheele. Priestley and Scheele had experimentally isolated oxygen, but failed to realize that they had discovered a previously unknown chemical element. Instead, they interpreted their finding within the framework of the prevailing phlogiston theory. It was Lavoisier who recognized oxygen as a new element, thereby refuting the entire phlogiston theory. Consequently, according to Engels, Lavoisier was the true discoverer of oxygen. Similarly, the quote, existence of the portion of the product's value that we now call surplus value. Similarly, the quote, existence of the portion of the product's value that we now call surplus value, unquote, had been noted long before Marx. However, while economists and socialists remained captive to the aforementioned theories, it was Marx who first recognized that this was a fact, quote, destined to revolutionize the whole of economics, unquote. Althusser, too, who emphasizes that the difference between Marx and classical economics lies in the fact that the former produces a new theoretical object, essentially concurred with Engels' account. Yet the view that the classical economists were already familiar with surplus value, but simply did not know what to do with it, largely obliterates the distinction between the empiricist conception of theory found in classical political economy and the non-empirical character of the theory of surplus value. The fact that Marx himself did not grasp the full extent of his divergence from Smith suggests that he, too, lacked complete clarity regarding the theoretical status of the theory of surplus value. This shortcoming would have later repercussions in his theory of capital, particularly in the context of the transformation of values into prices. In parentheses. Section 4. Value and average profit in David Ricardo. With Smith's work, the theoretical subject matter of political economy was definitively established. The terrain was thus laid out for subsequent authors. They had to relate to Smith. The terrain was thus laid out for subsequent authors. They had to relate to Smith, whether positively or negatively, without, however, being able to even remotely match his ubiquity. What often appears as Smith's personal genius is largely attributable to his specific position in the development of political economy. Ricardo, who alongside Smith is certainly the most significant representative of classical economics, also builds directly upon problems he encounters in Smith's work. However, Ricardo differs sharply from Smith in his method of argumentation. While Smith generally proceeds from a wealth of empirical facts and merely resorts to abstract models, Ricardo shifts a marked preference for using simplifying assumptions, to examine the mode of operation, to determine individual factors as precisely as possible. Marx regarded Ricardo as the, quote, completer of classical political economy, unquote, insofar as he formulated and developed the determination of exchange value by labor time in its purest form, unquote. Marx. Ricardo's theory of value emerged through direct engagement with Smith. It was a generally accepted consequence of Smith's production cost theory of value that an increase in wages, for instance, due to a rise in the price of corn, would lead to an increase in the cost of all commodities. Ricardo dismissed this view rather casually in his essay on profits. In his view, a wage increase resulted in a reduction of profits. However, this was a crucial point in the debate over the effects of the Corn Laws. The attempts to provide a better justification for his thesis likely played an important role in the drafting of Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, first published in 1817. In the preface, Ricardo identified the question of distribution as the fundamental problem of political economy that had not yet been adequately resolved. And it was precisely on this issue that he differed from Smith. The thesis that a wage increase leads to a rise in the value of all commodities raises the general question of the unit in which this general rise in value should be measured. To substantiate his critique of Smith, therefore, Ricardo had to address the theory of value first, unlike in the essay on profits. In the first chapter of his Principles, Ricardo initially appears to develop a clear labor theory of value. He praises Smith for recognizing that in the early stages of social development, the exchange value of commodities is determined by the relative quantity of labor expended on them, but then criticizes Smith for introducing another standard of measure of value, having introduced, quote, not the quantity of labor bestowed on the production of any object, but the quantity which it can command in the market, as if these were two equivalent expressions, unquote. Ricardo. In contrast to Smith, Ricardo states categorically, even in the heading of the first section of his chapter on value, quote, the value of a commodity, or the quantity of any other commodity for which it will exchange, depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production. And not on the greater or lesser compensation which is paid for that labor. Okay. However, this criticism of Smith is not entirely justified. It was noted earlier that while Smith did not employ two, quote, standard measures of value, unquote, he did distinguish the measure from the rule determining the quantity of labor a commodity commands. Furthermore, he held the view that this rule differed before and after the, quote, accumulation of stocks, unquote. In the third subsection, Ricardo examines how the use of tools and other aids to production affects value ratios, in concluding that value is influenced not only by labor directly expended, but also by labor embodied in tools and aids. Thus, commodity value ratios appear to be unequivocally determined by the quantities of labor, both direct and indirect, expended in their production and independent of wages. Consequently, this third section is usually interpreted as completing Ricardo's theory of value based on labor time, yet is revealed by an introductory paragraph omitted from the third edition. This section was originally directed against Smith's view that, following the, quote, accumulation of stock, unquote, Values were no longer regulated by the quantities of labor expended in production. Ricardo's aim in this section was to demonstrate that capital formation per se does not nullify the regulation of values by relative labor quantities. He examines the effect of wage changes using a numerical example, but introduces the restrictive assumption that the means of production employed by a worker in different branches of production are of equal value and durability. Under these conditions, Ricardo argues, the value ratio of commodities remains entirely independent of whether wages change or not. From the standpoint of a simple labor theory of value, the restriction Ricardo imposes does not initially appear plausible. Its significance only becomes apparent through the subsequent argument. In the next two subsections, Ricardo successively drops the assumptions just mentioned, equal value and durability of the means of production employed by a worker, and acknowledges a modification in the determination of value. Ricardo illustrates this modification through a series of calculations, some of which are quite elaborate. Perhaps the easiest way to grasp it is through the following example from the first edition. If in one branch of production, hunting, 150 units are invested in means of production, and 50 units in wages, while in another branch, fishing, 50 units are invested in the means of production, and 150 units in wages, and the profit rate is 10%, then assuming the means of production are entirely consumed, this being the only difference from Ricardo's original example, the value of the product in each branch is 220 units. If a wage increase of 6% occurs, reducing the profit rate to say 4%, the product of the hunting sector is then worth less, 211.12 units, than the product of the fishing sector, 217.36 units. That is, the relative value of the hunting product compared to the fishing product has fallen, even though there has been no change in the relative quantities of labor expended in production. A similar calculation can also be made for cases involving unequal durability of the means of production and unequal turnover times of capital. Under certain circumstances, therefore, changes in the wage rate can indeed lead to changes in relative values, so that Ricardo now recognizes two, quote, causes for changes in relative values. Quote, this difference in the degree of durability of fixed capital and this variety in the proportions in which the two sorts of capital may be combined introduce another cause, because besides the greater or lesser quantity of labor necessary to produce commodities for the variation in their relative value, this causes the rise or fall in the value of labor, end quote. Ricardo's argument, however, rests on the premise of a uniform rate of profit across all capitals. Changes in wages must lead to a change in relative values precisely so that all capitals continue to yield an equal rate of profit, even if that rate is lower or higher than before. The existence of a general rate of profit is the fundamental reason why mere changes in the wage rate, under the conditions specified above, lead to changes in relative values. Ricardo appears to have been aware of this as well. For instance, he states, quote, but those profits would be unequal if the price of goods did not vary with a rise or fall in the rate of profits, end quote. For Ricardo, the existence of an average rate of profit does not appear to be a fact requiring explanation. Like Smith before him, he accepts it as an empirical phenomenon. He views the modification of commodity prices resulting from the average profit as a, quote, just compensation, end quote, for the person who advances the capital. Thus, following an example in which he examines capitals with different turnover times, he states, quote, the difference in value arises in both cases from the profits being accumulated as capital and is only a just compensation for the time that the profits were withheld, end quote. Ricardo. For Ricardo, the average rate of profit appears to be an expression of general justice. Consequently, its establishment is always required, and its existence is, quote, natural. It is evident here that Ricardo, much like Smith, views economic phenomena from the perspective of the individual commodity owner or capitalist. This is further demonstrated by the fact that money, as a super-individual structure formation, plays no role in Ricardo's theory of value. In a later chapter, Ricardo even explicitly reduces the exchange of commodities to barter, with money serving merely as a formal intermediary. In doing so, he adopts the viewpoint of the individual commodity owner, for whom the circulation of commodities appears, in its outcome, as simple barter. By treating the commodity owner's standpoint as, quote, natural, and making it the starting point of his inquiries, Ricardo's theorizing is subject to the same anthropocentrism and individualism already observed in Smith. New section, Section 5. Ricardo as an inconsistent labor value theorist. On the critique of Marx's reception of classical economics, Part 2. It was noted earlier that Marx regards Ricardo's major scientific achievement to be his clear articulation of value determined by labor time, and his use of this concept as the starting point for analyzing the bourgeois system. Admittedly, Marx offers a critical assessment of Ricardo's determination of value through labor. Quote, the character of this, quote, labor is not further investigated. He therefore fails to grasp the connection between this labor and money, or the fact that it must manifest itself as money. Hence the erroneous theory of money. For Ricardo, the focus is from the outset solely on the magnitude of value. End quote. Marx. However, Marx appears to believe that Ricardo's flawed understanding of the relationship between value and money affects only his monetary theory, not his theory of value. In other words, Marx grants at least partial validity to a non-monetary concept of value based on quantities of labor. This point is destined to cause further confusion within his own theory of value and capital. See the 6th and 7th chapters below. Marx sees the flaws in Ricardo's theory of value as stemming primarily from his specific method of inquiry. Marx characterizes this approach as follows. Ricardo starts at the determination of value by labor time, and then examines whether other economic relations correspond to or contradict this determination. Thus he presupposes the entire system of capitalist relations when analyzing the value of commodities, rather than developing them successively and investigating their intrinsic connection to the determination of value. This is how Ricardo arrives at his, quote, modification of the value determination. He simply takes for granted the existence of a uniform average rate of profit for all capitals instead of investigating, quote, to what extent its existence actually corresponds to the determination of values by labor time. And you would have found that, far from corresponding to it, it prima facie contradicts it, that its existence must therefore be derived from a series of intermediate links, end quote. Marx. Consequently, Marx does not see excessive abstraction in Ricardo, but rather a, quote, lack of the power of abstraction, an inability to disregard profits when considering the values of commodities, a fact confronting him as a result of competition, end quote. Marx. Marx views Ricardo as a theorist of the labor theory of value who is consistent only at the beginning of his exposition, but who allows himself to be led astray during its execution, confusing values with prices of production. With this interpretive framework, Marx also credits Ricardo with a theory of surplus value. However, much like Smith, Ricardo failed to distinguish surplus value from its phenomenal forms. In fact, however, there are certain formulations in Ricardo's work that give the impression he examines surplus value at least quantitatively. For instance, Ricardo notes that, quote, profits would be high or low exactly in proportion as wages are low or high, end quote. And seemingly even more explicitly it is stated elsewhere, quote, there can be no rise in the value of labor without a fall of profits. If the corn is to be divided between the farmer and the laborer, the larger the proportion that is given to the latter, the less will remain for the former, end quote. Ricardo. In these passages, Ricardo appears to define profit as the remainder left after deducing wages from the value the worker adds to the product through their labor. Had Ricardo actually meant this, he would indeed have been treating surplus value, at least in terms of its quantitative determination, under the label of profit. Marx interprets these passages in precisely this way. However, Ricardo would have then overlooked the fact that profit conceived in this manner cannot depend on the size of the capital. Consequently, there would be no uniform rate of profit applicable to all capitals. There are, however, indications that Ricardo made no such oversight. The example he uses to illustrate the passage cited above involves the average rate of profit falling from 10% to 9% as a result of a wage increase. The illustrative calculations he uses to demonstrate the impact of wage changes on relative values are constructed in the same way. Wage increases result in a reduction of the profit rate, which is uniform across all capitals. Nowhere in his chapter on value does Ricardo construct an example where the amount by which an individual capital's total wage bill rises is equal to the amount by which their mass of profit falls. A change in wages always acts first upon the average rate of profit and only affects the individual capitalist's profit through the change in that rate. When Ricardo speaks of profits rising or falling depending on whether wages fall or rise, he does not have the individual capitalist or the individual worker's surplus labor in mind, but rather the distributive relationship between the classes. Contrary to Marx's interpretation, Ricardo is not dealing with surplus value, not even in a merely quantitative sense, but always with the average profit. Like Smith, Ricardo remains bound by the empirical reality of capitalist relations. The average profit appears to him as the immediately given datum from which scientific inquiry must proceed. However, Ricardo does not view this average profit as an independent, value-forming factor in the sense of the theory of production costs, but rather as the residual, determined by society as a whole, left over after wages are paid. The question arises here whether Marx's characterization of Ricardo as a theorist of the labor theory of value who was inconsistent in its application, a view underlying Marx's belief that Ricardo possessed a theory of surplus value, does not itself misrepresent Ricardo's theory of value. While Marxist authors accept Marx's interpretation of Ricardo almost without reservation, it fell to non-Marxist authors to examine the nature of Ricardo's labor theory of value more closely. For a long time, a view tracing back to Hollander and Cannon was widespread, that Ricardo had increasingly retreated from his determination of relative values by labor over the course of the 3 editions of the Principles. In a detailed textual analysis within the introduction to his edition of the Principles, however, Sraffa was able to demonstrate that the changes made in the 2nd and 3rd editions do not justify such a view. Sraffa identifies only one instance of temporary vacillation. In the well-known and frequently cited letter Ricardo wrote to McCulloch on the 13th of June, 1820, there Ricardo writes, quote, "I sometimes think that if I were to write the chapter on value again, which is in my book, I should acknowledge that the relative value of commodities was regulated by 2 causes instead of by 1, namely by the relative quantity of labor necessary to produce the commodities in question, and by the rate of profit for the time that the capital remained dormant, until the commodities were brought to market. Perhaps I would find the difficulties nearly as great as in this view of the subject as in that which I have adopted." End quote. Ricardo. Sraffa notes that Ricardo's revised the chapter on value during the following 6 months without adopting this new perspective. In subsequent months, he reaffirmed his adherence to the determination of value by labor time in various letters, writing to McCulloch, quote, "We are in the right, of course. We are in the right course," end quote. Sraffa is undoubtedly correct that the substance of Ricardo's argument did not change between the 1st and 3rd editions of the Principles. However, the letter to McCulloch cited above does not refer to that aspect of all. Rather, the phrase, quote, "view of the subject," end quote, seems to me to refer to the mode of presentation. Ricardo is concerned with whether to maintain his existing method of exposition, namely determining the relative value of commodities initially solely by labor time and subsequently modifying that determination with another factor, or whether to declare from the outset that there are 2 causes determining relative values. While he did remain faithful to his original mode of presentation in the 3rd section, he did make at least a stylistic concession to this alternative, quote, "view of the subject," end quote. In 2 places, Ricardo speaks for the first time of, quote, "causes of variations in relative values," a term he had not used previously, and in both instances he contrasts the 2, quote, "causes," thereby elevating the status of the second cause so much that it is no longer a mere modification, as it had been in the subsection heading. In one of these 2 places, Ricardo introduces wage changes, assuming unequal capital composition, as, quote, "another cause," end quote, "of variations in relative values." In the other, he compares the quantitative significance of the two causes, a comparison made for the first time in the third edition. And in making this comparison, Ricardo concludes that a change in the quantities of labor required to produce commodities has a far greater impact on relative values than on a change in wages. He is convinced that he is, quote, on the right course, unquote, regarding the determinations of value by relative labor quantities. Although Ricardo did not substantially alter his theory of value across the three editions of the Principles, the question remains as to how exactly he determined value through labor. After determining values based on labor times in the first section of his chapter on value, he examined production prices (in Marxian terminology) in the second section. In the first sentence of the chapter titled On Natural and Market Price, Ricardo explicitly equates, quote, value with the, quote, natural price, unquote, Ricardo, 1817. That is, the price that yields the average rate of profit for all capitalists. Marx therefore accuses Ricardo of confusing value with the price of production. However, this accusation holds true only if Ricardo, in his first chapter, had understood value as being determined solely by the quantity of labor necessary for production. Yet, as demonstrated above, Ricardo did nothing of the sort. He consistently proceeds from the assumption of an average rate of profit. In other words, he has prices of production in mind from the very beginning, even when speaking of, quote, values. This implies that at the start of his chapter on value, Ricardo is not developing a labor theory of value that he subsequently abandons. Rather, albeit without making this sufficiently clear, he examines exchange ratios under the assumption of equal composition and equal turnover times for the employed capital. Only under these conditions are exchange ratios proportional to the relative quantities of labor required for production. If these conditions do not obtain, however, exchange ratios are no longer dependent solely on relative labor quantities. Marx's accusation that Ricardo conflates values and prices of production is therefore unjustified. Ricardo is not the inconsistent labor value theorist Marx takes him to be. And this whole thing right here about how Ricardo assuming a general rate, an average rate of profit, and analyzing prices of production when discussing values. This reminds me of the whole Sraffian paradigm, which I'm not an expert on, but I know one of their things that one of the principles that they put forward that is that the labor theory of value is in some sense redundant. It means you don't need to have a theory of, to some extent, you don't need to have a theory of value that's distinct from prices of production. So you don't need there's if this is kind of, it seems like it's related to that in some way, the idea that it's the labor theory of value is unnecessary for Marxian social analysis. Anyway, however, Marx's critique of Ricardo is not simply, quote, a mere verbal muddle on Marx's part, unquote, or a, quote, methodological error presenting the confrontation of two theories, his own and Ricardo's, as an imminent critique, unquote. Fils d'eux. In his attempt to cast Ricardo as a pure theorist of prices of production, Steedman overlooks the latter's ambivalences. To begin with, Ricardo's exposition, which initially discusses labor values without any qualification, suggests interpreting him as an exponent of a labor theory of value. Yet the problem is not limited to the form of presentation. Ricardo believes that the determination of value by relative quantities of labor, that is, the case where labor values coincide with prices of production, was in some sense central to understanding prices of production. He failed to grasp what was only revealed by the development of linear production theory from Dmitriev through Bertkiewicz to Sraffa, namely that this is merely a special case which need not be taken into account when calculating a general system of prices of production. In this respect, Ricardo is an inconsistent theorist of prices of production. The quote, verbal muddle Steedman speaks of lies first and foremost with Ricardo himself. However, there is another issue regarding Ricardo that lends support to Marx's interpretation. In several places, Ricardo speaks of labor as the, quote, foundation of value, and even refers to it as at one point as the, quote, original source of exchange value. Yet he develops no concept of labor as a value-forming substance. Ricardo is not interested in the magnitudes of value of individual commodities, but rather in value ratios and their fluctuations. He emphasizes that he is interested only in the, quote, variations in the relative value of commodities and not in their absolute value, end quote. And he determines these, quote, relative values, and, quote, not by, quote, labor per se, but by the, quote, comparative quantity of labor expended, end quote. Yet if relative values are determined by relative quantities of labor, the inference naturally arises that absolute values are determined by absolute quantities of labor. It is precisely this conclusion that Marx imputes as the immanent logic of Ricardo's argument. However, Ricardo not only emphasized that he had drawn no such conclusion, in his final letter to McCulloch, he even explicitly rejected the notion that a commodity possesses value in proportion to the labor expended on its product. In that case, however, it is by no means clear in what sense one can speak of labor as the, quote, foundation or, quote, original source, end quote, of value. While Ricardo can make statements regarding value ratios and their changes, he cannot say anything about what actually constitutes the value objectivity of commodities. Over time, Ricardo himself must have perceived this as a problem, the absence of a concept of value, or of an immanent measure of value, that is, of value substance, seems to me the reason for his increase in the intense preoccupation with a, quote, invariable measure of value, end quote. This problem, treated only in passing in the first two editions of the Principles, is accorded a new subsection within the chapter on value in the third edition. Furthermore, the manuscript Absolute Value and Exchangeable Value, discovered only by Sraffa and written in the final weeks before Ricardo's death, deals exclusively with this issue. By the third edition of the Principles, Ricardo had reached the following conclusion, quote, if it were possible that in the production of our money, for instance, the same quantum of labor should at all times be required, still it would not be a perfect standard or invariable measure of value. Because, as I have endeavored to explain, it would be subject to relative variations from a rise or fall of wages, an account of the different proportions of fixed capital which might be necessary to produce it, and to produce those other commodities whose alteration of value we wish to ascertain, end quote. Ricardo does not advance beyond this position even in his final manuscript. However, the absence of an invariable measure of value appears there as a far more pressing problem. The issue for Ricardo is no longer merely, as it was in the Principles, which commodity has undergone a change in absolute value, when the exchange ratio between two commodities shifted. He now addresses the matter at a much more fundamental level. Quote, there is this difference, however, between a measure of length and a measure of value. With respect to the measure of length, we have a criterion by which we can always be sure of regulating it to the same uniform length, or of making a due allowance for any deviation. In the measure of value, we have no such criterion. Ricardo. By noting that he lacks a criterion for a measure of value altogether, even though he understands the causes of changes in value ratios, Ricardo begins to realize that he does not know what value actually is. He now explicitly addresses the case where the relative values of commodities produced at the same amount of labor can diverge, even in the absence of wage changes. Whereas in the Principles, his attention had been focused on divergences in relative values caused by wage fluctuations. Ricardo's interest in an invariable measure of value was therefore not merely, as Sraffa suggests, an expression of the problem that the absolute magnitude of the national product, the distribution of which among the classes Ricardo sought to analyze, shifted merely as a result of a change in that distribution. It stemmed from a much more fundamental issue, the question of the substance of value. Marx, too, appears to not have been aware of this, though he drew no... Marx, too, appears to have been aware of this, though he drew no conclusions from it regarding his assessment of Ricardian value theory. In this final manuscript of Ricardo's, Meek, like Sraffa, perceived an, quote, increasing tendency to identify the absolute value of a commodity with the quantity of labor embodied in it, end quote. End quote. Ronald Meek. The passage that appears to lend the strongest support to such an interpretation reads as follows. Quote, I may be asked what I mean by the word value, and by what criterion I would judge whether a commodity had or had not changed its value. I answer, I know no other criterion of the thing being dear or cheap, but by the sacrifices of labor made to obtain it. Everything is originally purchased by labor. Nothing that is valued can be produced without it. That the greater or lesser quantity of labor worked up in the commodities can be the only cause of their alteration in value is completely made out as soon as we are agreed that all commodities are the produce of labor and would have no value but for the labor expended upon them. End quote. Ricardo. This passage, which appears unambiguous yet contradicts many of Ricardo's earlier statements, is found on a single sheet prepared after the rough draft of the manuscript and presents a first attempt at revision. Immediately following the quoted passage on this single sheet is just one further sentence, parenthesis, cited by neither Sraffa nor Meek, end parenthesis. Quote, though this is true, it is still exceedingly difficult to discover or even imagine any commodity which shall be a perfect general measure of value, as we shall see by the observations which follow, end quote. However, since one cannot even, quote, imagine such a perfect measure, the concept entails even greater difficulties than the previous statements might suggest. Yet the promised, quote, observations do not follow. Instead, there is a new approach to revising the draft, in which no comparable passages are to be found. Rather, it is noted there, as was already the case in the third edition of the Principles, that even a commodity whose production consistently required the same amount of labor would not constitute a perfect measure of value, because not all commodities are produced under the same conditions. Although Ricardo grappled with the problem of determining the substance of value in his final manuscript, he does not become the, quote, pure labor theorist of value that Sraffa and Meek take him to be. The fact that Marx believed Ricardo had already determined value solely through labor time in the Principles, and it merely failed to be sufficient, consists in the subsequent elaboration cannot be attributed solely to the ambiguities in Ricardo's work mentioned earlier. Marx acknowledges that Ricardo, quote, consciously abstracts from the form of competition, from the semblance of competition, in order to grasp the laws of such, end quote. Marx. Accordingly, Ricardo has moved beyond the level of empirical phenomena. At the same time, however, Marx criticizes Ricardo for regarding, quote, the phenomenal form immediately, directly as a verification or manifestation of the general laws, without in any way developing it, end quote, and thus treating his abstraction as merely, quote, formal abstraction, end quote. Marx. Yet Ricardo's conception of phenomenal forms as immediate verification of the discovered laws implies nothing less than that, for Ricardo, laws and phenomenal forms exist on the same theoretical plane. What Ricardo achieves through his abstraction amounts to nothing more than idealized models of empirical reality. His empiricism, however, precludes the construction of a non-empirical theoretical level, a level Marx prematurely credits him with having established. Marx is fair to recognize this demonstrates, as is already evident in his interpretation of Smith, that he did not fully grasp the non-empirical status of his own theory. New section, Section 6, Value Theory as a Critique of Capitalism. the quote Ricardian socialist. The labor movement evolved alongside the development of capitalism. At the beginning of the 19th century, the labor movement in England was still closely linked to bourgeois reform movements. However, during the 1820s and 1830s, the antagonism between the two grew increasingly pronounced. This development was also reflected in debates surrounding political economy. Between 1820 and 1840, various authors drew the conclusion from the classical labor theory of value that all wealth is produced exclusively by labor, and that workers therefore have a right to the entire product of their labor. Since Löwenthal's study, Löwenthal 1911, it has become customary to refer to these authors as quote Ricardian socialists. While political economy had previously been used primarily as a weapon against landowners and feudal power structures, it is now criticized as a discipline that legitimized capital vis-a-vis the working class. However, and this is the crucial point for our context, this critique remained itself bound by the premises of political economy. As early as 1821, an anonymous text appeared that attempted to reduce capitalist profit to the surplus labor of workers. Its author begins with the, as he himself notes, generally accepted proposition that labor is the source of all wealth and income. He then defines the concept of, quote, surplus labor as the labor performed by an individual that exceeds what is necessary for the maintenance of that person and their family. And with this concept, he explains the income of the capital owner. Quote, the possessor of capital, who no longer uniting his labor to the labor of the society, maintains himself on the interest or the surplus labor of others that is paid him for the use of his capital, whether in the nature of rent or interest of money, etc. Anonymous. Marx credits the author with a significant advance over Ricardo and Smith through explicitly resolving profit into surplus labor. Indeed, profit is here grouped together with interest and rent as merely different names for surplus labor, such that it seems as though only the term, quote, surplus value, end quote, is missing. However, this resolution of profit into surplus labor does not stem from any theory of value, that is, from any theory dealing with bourgeois economics, but rather from the simple fact, valid in every society, that those who do not live by their own labor are sustained by the labor of others, that the social surplus product appropriated by one class is produced by the surplus labor of another class. While the author clearly recognized the essential content of exploitation, he did not recognize the specific form of its mediation within bourgeois society. The most significant representative of the so-called, quote, Ricardian socialists was Thomas Hodgkin, whose commonly claimed that he adopted Ricardo's labor theory of value and developed it into a theory of exploitation. See, for example, Blaug, 1958. Indeed, Hodgkin does appeal to Ricardo's theory, which without explicitly stating so, would confirm that the claims of capital were the cause of the working class's poverty. However, Hodgkin was initially very critical of Ricardo, regarding his theory as a justification for capitalist relations. Hodgkin's own theoretical approach is better understood as a radicalization of Smith's theory of value rather than Ricardo's. Fundamental to this is his distinction between, quote, natural and, quote, social price. Quote, natural or necessary prices means the whole quantity of labor nature requires from man that he may produce any commodity. Labor was the original, is now and ever will be the only purchase money in dealing This quote's fucked up. Labor is the original. I'm just going to read it because it's fucked up there, so take this quote with a grain of salt. There's another description. Labor was the original, is now and ever will be the only purchase money in dealing with nature. There is another description of price to which I shall give the name social. It is natural price enhanced by social regulations. Whatever quantity of labor may be requisite to produce any commodity, the laborer must always, in the present state of society, give a great deal more labor to acquire and possess it than is requisite to buy it from nature. Natural price, thus increased to the laborer, is social price. probably natural price, thus increased by the labor, is social price. That's what I imagine it's supposed to say. Anyway, end quote. Hodgkin, 1827. Not only do the emphatic terms Hodgkin uses to portray the natural price as the price, quote, nature demands derive almost verbatim from Smith's justification of labor as the measure of value, but the concept of the, quote, social price as an increase over the natural price also aligns with the determination of value Smith provided for capitalist conditions. Since the value of a commodity is no longer regulated solely by the labor time necessary for its production, but also includes a share for profit and rent, it follows that the worker must pay more in labor time for the commodity than is required to produce it. Given that workers pay the difference between the, quote, natural and the, quote, social price, and that this difference constitutes profit and rent, one could argue that Hodgkin, more so than Smith or Ricardo, grasped the concept of surplus value, quote, in substance, unquote. However, he was able to do so only because, much like the aforementioned anonymous author, he did not concern himself with details such as the determination of the magnitude of commodity values and the average rate of profit. Marx acknowledges that the left Ricardians represent a, quote, opposition to the economists, yet an opposition that, quote, itself proceeds from the premises of the economists, end quote. Marx. They do not step outside the theoretical framework of bourgeois economics. Hodgkin defines the subject matter of political economy within the same anthropological framework that popularized Smith and Ricardo. That characterized Smith. Well, let me repeat that. Hodgkin defines the subject matter of political economy within the same anthropological framework that characterized Smith and Ricardo. In his Popular Political Economy, the book, Hodgkin writes that Smith demonstrated the division of labor to be the result of human instinct and continues, quote, "It is with these natural interests, passions, instincts, and affections, and with their consequences, that political economy principally deals. To them this book is almost exclusively confined." Quote, "And on them and on their performance is founded the natural science of national wealth." End quote. Hodgkin. For Hodgkin, political economy even becomes a natural science. Just as it did for Smith and Ricardo, commodity production appears to Hodgkin as a natural mode of production suited to humanity. He views the exchange of equivalents as an expression of natural justice. Since the exchange between capital and labor apparently does not involve the exchange of equivalents, meaning the worker no longer owns everything they have produced, this exchange is unjust. The idealization that bourgeois society produces of itself is confronted with actual conditions and made the yardstick of criticism. The critique leveled by the Ricardian socialists remains trapped within the very premises of the critique itself. Marx's mode of critique is neither identical to this moral critique, see Chapter 9, nor did Marx, as is sometimes claimed, adopt his theory of value and surplus value from the Ricardian socialists. Nevertheless, they were not unimportant to Marx. Marx first engaged with Smith and Ricardo in 1844. In the economic and philosophical manuscripts, Marx criticized their, quote, cynicism, speaking of labor as the source of all wealth in light of the workers' wretched plight, and endorsed Say's argument against the Ricardian labor theory of value. It was not until 1847, in Marx's dispute with Proudhon and the Poverty of Philosophy, that he referred positively to the labor theory of value. Marx may well have been prompted to undertake a deeper engagement with Ricardo, which must have occurred between 1844 and 1847, by the Ricardian socialist use of the labor theory of value to critique capitalism. He likely encountered some of their writings during his, the translation didn't work, and became acquainted during a period of study in Manchester in 1845. At the very least, an excerpt from William Thompson has been preserved in the Manchester notebooks. Okay, and that's the end of the chapter itself, and here are the footnotes, which I'm not going to try to connect to anything. 1. Due to backward economic and political conditions, this self-reflection of civil society in Germany takes the form of an idealistic philosophy of law and history. And Footnote. Marx characterizes this very clearly, quote, "In this society of free competition, the individual appears detached from the natural bonds, etc., which in earlier historical epochs made him an appendage of a specific limited human conglomerate. For the prophets of the 18th century, on whose shoulders Smith and Ricardo still stand. This 18th century individual, the product on the one hand of the dissolution of feudal social forms and on the other of the productive forces newly developed since the 16th century, hover as an ideal whose existence belongs to the past, not as a historical result but as the starting point of history, conceived as the individual in the state of nature, corresponding to their notion of human nature, not as one arising historically but as one posited by nature. End quote. Marx. And footnote. Footnote. By classical political economy, Marx understood the economics oriented toward the labor theory of value, ranging from Petty to Ricardo. In contrast, non-Marxist accounts usually classify all economists, whether oriented toward the labor theory of value or not, active in the period between 1776, the publication year of Smith's Wealth of Nations, and the marginalist revolution of 1871 as, quote, classical. In what follows, I adopt Marx's usage of the term as it expresses a substantive rather than merely chronological connection. 4. In contrast to many Marxist-oriented works who interpret the history of theory from the outset within the framework established by Marx, e.g. Grossman, 1941, Reichelt, 1970 and 1976, Rojas, 1989, Brentel, 1989, the question is raised here as to whether Marx's interpretation of Smith and Ricardo actually just does justice to those authors. And footnote. Quote, the grass that my horse has eaten, the turf that my servant has cut, become my property without the instruction or consent of anyone. End quote. Locke. And footnote. McPherson, 1962, in particular drew attention to this fact in his influential interpretation of Locke. On the concept of natural law in Locke, see also Euchner, 1969, and footnote. Quote, the great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. End quote. Locke. End footnote. The appropriation of land was, however, not merely a process that occurred in the distant past. It also took place during the dissolution of feudal relations. Through the, quote, enclosures of the 17th and 18th centuries, common land was transformed into private property, thereby destroying the livelihood of many families. Yet these enclosures were also the prerequisite for increased labor productivity which, according to Locke and his successors, was ultimately intended to benefit the poor as well. And footnote, quote, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest, end quote. Adam Smith. And footnote, the very first sentence states, quote, how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from their happiness except the pleasure of seeing it. End quote. Smith. And footnote. Raphael, 1975, regarding the role of the, quote, see Raphael, 1975, regarding the role of the, quote, impartial spectator, end quote, on the tension between the empiricist explanatory and normative aspects of this view, see Campbell, 1975. And footnote, the debate is discussed by McPhee and Raphael in the introduction to Smith, 1759. So I guess that's the theory of moral sentiments. Footnote, quote, and it is well that nature imposes upon us in this manner. It is this deception which rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. End quote. Smith. Footnote, here Smith appears to adopt the position of Mandeville, whom he had in fact sharply criticized in the theory of moral sentiments. As Coletti rightly pointed out, the difference between Smith and Mandeville lies primarily in the fact that for Mandeville, any egoistic course of action constitutes a, quote, vice, whereas for Smith, behavior oriented towards self-interest represents something positive. Unlike Smith, Mandeville remains partly rooted in the mindset of the Christian Middle Ages, where, quote, greed was counted among the 7 deadly sins, merely highlighting and expressing some surprise at the contradiction. Its positive effects. The liberal bourgeoisie, by contrast, views self-interested behavior as the embodiment of the highest degree of rationality and is thus unwilling to criticize it as an individual vice. And footnote. Footnote. The very first sentence of Smith's inquiry states, quote, "The annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with all the necessaries and conveniences of life, which it annually consumes, and which consists always either in the immediate producer of that labor or in what is purchased with that produce from other nations." Okay. Smith. Quote, "If a man can bring to London an ounce of silver out of the earth of Peru, in the same time that he can produce a bushel of corn, then what is the natural price of the other?" And quote. Petty. And footnote. Footnote. In contrast, Hollander, 1973 and 1975, attempted to demonstrate that Smith had by no means ruled out an explanation of relative prices based on relative scarcity. However, the only evidence he can cite consists of a few passages in which Smith acknowledges that utility and scarcity exert an influence on prices in certain situations. And footnote. Footnote. Quote, "The value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it, and who means not to use or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. Labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities." End quote. Smith. And footnote. Footnote. This line of thought is expressed even more clearly in a later passage. Quote, "Equal quantities of labor at all times and places may be said to be of equal value to the laborer. In his ordinary state of health, strength, and spirits, in the ordinary degree of his skill and dexterity, he must always lay down the same portion of his ease, his freedom, and his happiness." End quote. Smith. Footnote. Smith sees the transition from the barbaric to the civilized state of humanity as a division of labor. Civilized history begins and ends with the, quote, "accumulation of stocks," end quote, with the system of, quote, "natural liberty," end quote. The inherent problems of Smith's construction are examined in detail by Levine, 1977. And footnote. Footnote. Meek, 1956, is one of the few authors who acknowledge this distinction. The full significance of this distinction has not become clear to many readers of Smith, or Marx, as will be shown later, in parentheses. And footnote. Footnote. This dynamic aspect is overlooked, and Smith is cast as a progenitor of an essentially static theory of resource allocation, as is the case with Stigler. Hence the problem of the Hence the problem of the transformation of values into prices of production. Marx points out the systematic rather than merely coincidental discrepancy between labor values and prices in a footnote to the first volume of Capital. And footnote. Footnote. Quote, "After he has articulated the inner connection, he is suddenly once again dominated by the view of the phenomenon. The connection of the matter as it appears in competition, and in competition everything always appears distorted, constantly turned upside down." End quote. Marx. Footnote. Althusser terms Marx's reading of the classical economist, quote, "symptomatic," insofar as, quote, "in a single process, it reveals what is hidden in the text being read and relates it to another text, which in a state of necessary absence is present within the first text." End quote. Althusser. However, in contrast to the examples discussed at length by Althusser, Marx is not aware of the symptomatic nature of his reading in this particular case. And footnote. Footnote. Quote, "Because Adam develops surplus value in terms of its substance, but not explicitly in the form of a specific category, distinct from its particular forms, he subsequently conflates it directly with a further developed form of profit. This error persists in Ricardo and all his successors." Okay. Marx. New footnote. Schumpeter termed the attempt to solve practical problems through inferences drawn from highly abstract models the, quote, Ricardian vice, end quote, Schumpeter. However, such a judgment by no means does justice to Ricardo. In a letter to Malthus dated May 4th, 1820, Ricardo addresses this very point. Quote, our differences may in some respects, I think, be ascribed to your considering my book as more practical than I intended it to be. My object was to elucidate principles, and to do this I imagined strong cases that I might show the operation of those principles, end quote. Ricardo. Hollander, who in his voluminous study attempts to overturn virtually all prevailing views on Ricardo, also disputes the existence of significant methodological differences between Smith and Ricardo, a position that, in my view, is hardly tenable. And that's like something that I do know about Ricardo, is that he's one of the people who's like kind of viewed as like one of, even though Marx accused him of not being abstract enough, generally in economics, he's viewed as like one of the first people to be like talk about economic life on such an abstract like model kind of level. Anyway, and footnote. Footnote, quote, the principle of the quantity of labor bestowed on the productive commodities regulates their relative value, considerably modified by the employments of machinery and other fixed and durable capital, end quote. Ricardo. And footnote. Footnote. Yet in doing so, Ricardo by no means reverts to the Smithian determination of value, for in Ricardo's framework, wages do not constitute an independent component of value whose increase would automatically trigger a rise in the value of commodities. He expressly highlights the demonstration of this point as his own contribution. End footnote. Footnote. See also elsewhere, quote, as we have shown, every alteration in the permanent rate of profits would have some effects on the relative value of all these goods, end quote. Quote, independently of any alteration in the quantity of labor employed on their production, end quote. Ricardo. And footnote. Footnote. In his final manuscript, Absolute Value and Exchangeable Value, Ricardo also speaks of the capitalist profit as, quote, remuneration for the accumulated labor which is necessary for the capitalist to advance in order that the commodity might be produced, end quote. Ricardo. And footnote. Footnote, quote, productions are always bought by productions or by services. Money is only the medium by which the exchange is effected, end quote. Ricardo. A consequence of this view is that money is economically completely insignificant, a conclusion that John Stuart Mill then explicitly drew. Quote, there cannot, in short, be intrinsically a more significant thing in the economy of society than money, except in the character of a contrivance of sparing time and labor. It is a machine for doing quickly and commodiously what would be done, though less quickly and commodiously, without it, end quote. John Stuart Mill. End footnote. Footnote. Ricardo is celebrated with particular emphasis in theories of surplus value. Smith, it is argued, operated in a state of, quote, perpetual contradiction, end quote, by pursuing on the one hand, quote, the interconnection of the economic categories or the hidden structure of the bourgeois economic system, end quote, and on the other, quote, the connection as it appears in the phenomena of competition, end quote. Both views, which Marx terms, quote, esoteric and, quote, exoteric, become intermingled in Smith's work and cause considerable confusion among his successors. Quote, but Ricardo finally intervenes and calls out to the science, halt, the foundation, the starting point of the physiology of the bourgeois system, of grasping its internal organic interconnection and life process, is the determination of value by labor time. Ricardo proceeds from this and compels the science to abandon its previous rut, end quote. Marx, theories of surplus value. End footnote. End footnote. Footnote. Such examples are indeed found in the chapter on profit, but under the assumption that production takes place without constant capital. In this trivial case, the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit are equal. End footnote. Footnote. This perspective encompasses the whole of society encompassing the whole of society becomes particularly clear at a point where Ricardo speaks of wage increases based on a reduced monetary value, not diminishing profits. Since, quote, no greater proportion of the annual labor of the country is devoted to the support of the laborer, end quote, Ricardo. End footnote. Deal, D-I-E-H-L, in 1905 and Marshall, 1920, had already questioned whether Ricardo actually advocated a labor theory of value, with Marshall also attempting to reconcile Ricardo with Jevons, a new attempt to attribute a demand theory to Ricardo, thereby making him a precursor to Walras and Marshall. Comes from Hollander. I believe it's Samuel Hollander. Check out the book I have on Ricardo's economic theory. Samuel Hollander is one of those people. He wrote a huge book. I don't know if I might have already said this in this video. I'm recording it in chunks. But Hollander was one of the... Hollander was a... what's the word? He's one of the people who kind of who provided a sort of a... he wrote a huge book on Ricardo, but he's definitely one of the people, in contrast to Sraffa, to my understanding or my memory of the book, tried to fit Ricardo within a kind of marginalist framework. End footnote. Footnote. In this respect, Stigler's view that Ricardo advocated a, quote, empirical but not, quote, analytical labor theory of value is not entirely unjustified. End footnote. Footnote, quote, let us suppose that all commodities are at their natural price, and consequently that the profits of capital and all employments are exactly at the same rate, end quote. Ricardo. Footnote, Ricardo highlights this distinction in a remark added to the third edition as a result of debates with Malthus. Quote, it is necessary for me also to remark that I have not said, because one commodity has so much labor bestowed upon it as will cost £1,000, and another so much as will cost £2,000, that therefore one would be of the value of £1,000 and the other of the value of £2,000. But I have said that their value will be to each other as 2 to 1, and that in those proportions they will be exchanged. I affirm only that their relative value will be governed by the relative quantities of labor bestowed on their production. Ricardo. Footnote 40. In this letter, written on August 21st, 1823, 3 weeks before his death, Ricardo expressly distanced himself from such a view. In the course of a discussion regarding the measure of value, he remarked, quote, this, I think, is Torrens' mode of estimating value, for it is in fact saying that commodities are valuable according to the value of the capital employed in their production, and the time for which it is so employed. This is a different thing from saying the commodities are valuable according to the quantity of labor worked up in them. I do not agree with either proposition, Ricardo. And footnote. Footnote. Therefore, Ricardo's search for an invariant measure of value is neither surprising nor something to be downplayed, contrary to the view expressed by Sheffield in the preface to the translation he edited of a portion of Ricardo's manuscript. Moreover, this presentation of Ricardo's text is problematic. While the original consists of a longer draft and the beginning of a later revision, the translation begins with the revised version, to which an excerpt from the draft is appended. Although this avoids repetition and creates an impression of greater coherence for the reader, the sharpening of the line of thought found in the original manuscript is lost in this arrangement of the text. And footnote. Footnote. In the course of his engagement with Bailey, Marx writes, quote, the problem of the search, Michael Heinrich, in bracket, for a, quote, invariable measure of value, end quote, was in fact merely a misleading way of expressing the search for the concept, for the nature of value itself, whose own determination could not itself be a value, and thus would not be subject to changes as value. This was labor time, social labor as it specifically manifests itself in commodity production. End quote. Marx. And footnote. Footnote, and I think this is related to the bit on Ricardian socialists. I think we're moving into that territory now. I'm not sure. Its author was likely Charles Wentworth Dilke, or Dilke, D-I-L-K-E. End footnote. Footnote. And at a later point it states, quote, the capitalist will exact from the laborers the produce of every hour's labor beyond what is possible for the laborer to subsist on, end quote. And footnote. Footnote, quote, this little-known pamphlet represents a significant advance beyond Ricardo. It explicitly identifies surplus value, or, quote, profit, as Ricardo calls it, as, quote, surplus value. Let me repeat that whole footnote. Quote, this little-known pamphlet represents a significant advance beyond Ricardo. It explicitly identifies surplus value, or, quote, profit, as Ricardo calls it, as, quote, surplus labor, the labor that the worker performs gratis. Just as it was crucial to resolve value into labor, so too was it crucial to resolve surplus value, which manifests itself as surplus product, into surplus labor. This is, in fact, already stated by Adam Smith and constitutes a key element of Ricardo's development. Yet nowhere in his work is it articulated and pinned down in this absolute form, end quote, Marx, Jesus Christ. End footnote. Footnote, the author appears to accept Smith's theory of production cost uncritically. Regarding a possible reduction in the price of corn, he writes that this would lower the cost of all goods due to falling wages, since the price of labor is a component of the price of goods. End footnote. Footnote, Burkhardt, 1980, on the connection between anti-capitalist theory and the labor movement, using the example of Thomas Hodgkin. End footnote. Footnote, see the letter from Hodgkin to Francis Place cited in Hunt, 1977. End footnote. Footnote, however, the attempt by Hunt, 1977 and 1980, to attribute to Hodgkin a theory of capital largely identical to Marx's is no more convincing than King's 1983 attempt, to interpret the theories of the left Ricardians as an anticipation of the materialist conception of history. End footnote. Footnote, Hodgkin states, quote, but as all the advantages derived from division of labor naturally center in and naturally belong to the laborers, if they are deprived of them, and in the progress of society, those only are enriched by their improved skill who never labor, this must arise from unjust appropriation, end quote. Thomas Hodgkin, 1827. And footnote. Footnote, while Samuelson views Marx merely as a, quote, minor post-Ricardian, end quote, Schumpeter, at least, describes Marx as, quote, the greatest among the Ricardian socialists, end quote. Schumpeter. Okay, and that is the end of Chapter 1 of Michael Heinrich's The Science of Value. Thank you so much for listening.